The late Stephen Sondheim's award-winning musical Into the Woods blends together some well-known fairy tales to tell an original story about wishes and curses and parenting and morality and consequences. Now, if you've never seen a stage production or the 2014 Disney adaptation, warning, here be spoilers. Act 1 introduces the familiar characters of Cinderella, Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood, and Jack, who trades his cow for some magic beans. And their stories more or less play out as we know them. And those stories are not the Disneyfied versions of the animated movies, but are, shall we say, grim. So when one prince is trying to find the owner of Cinderella's slipper, the stepmother cuts off one stepsister's toe and the other stepsister's heel to try to get it to fit. And when another prince is trying to help Rapunzel escape from the witch, he's blinded by the brambles that she conjures. You know, just the sort of details you share with impressionable young children before you tuck them in for the night. Still, by the end of Act 1, everyone has more or less got what they wanted. Cinderella's living in the castle. Rapunzel is found by her prince and her tears heal him. Little Red survived the visit to her grandmother's house and now sports a nice new fur coat. And Jack and his mother are newly rich thanks to all the gold that he stole from the giant. Jack even chopped down the beanstalk, killing the giant in the fall, and all the characters congratulate themselves on living happily ever after. Only there was one more magic bean, and nobody noticed that another beanstalk was already growing. When it comes to Act 2, everything quickly goes downhill, making Into the Woods less of a musical comedy and more a competition with Hamlet to see which has the higher body count. The core of Act 2 is a moral dilemma. When another giant climbs down the beanstalk, destroying homes, trampling the woods, and seeking revenge for her dead husband, the surviving characters have to decide what to do. Only they can't decide. Instead, they blame one another for everything that's gone wrong. They describe everything that happened before as somebody else's fault until they are interrupted by the witch. She scolds them over their inability to accept the consequences of their own actions, when the right course of action would be to hand Jack over to the giant in order to save everyone else. You're so nice, she tells them. You're not good, you're not bad, you're just nice. I'm not good, I'm not nice, I'm just right. And then she vanishes in a cloud of frustration. Now, this isn't the first time in Into the Woods that distinctions are made between being nice, right, and good. Earlier in Act 1, after she and her grandmother are saved from the wolf, Little Red reflects on what she learned. At first, the wolf seemed nice, showing her where she could find some pretty flowers, but all along his actual plan was to eat her. And so, summing up the things she knows now, Little Red concludes that nice is different than good. I've talked about this before. My colleague, the Reverend Kimberly Debus, for example, makes the point in a UU World article that Unitarian Universalism doesn't call us to be nice. Rather, she says, our faith calls us to be kind. As Debus put it, kindness sees a need and offers to help. Kindness stands up for the person being bullied and then makes sure they're safe. Kindness disrupts lawlessness and incivility. Kindness goes out of its way. Kindness recycles, kindness holds the door, kindness builds a ramp, kindness explains, and kindness knows its privilege and uses it to build justice. Kindness is not easy. Kindness is sometimes uncomfortable because it requires us to not stay comfortable, to not stay nice and docile. By contrast, Debus explains, being nice just doesn't cut the mustard. Niceness buys into the gospel of comfort and says we don't want to offend. Niceness is complacent. Niceness doesn't make waves, and it lets people have their own version of truth. Niceness doesn't want to bother anybody. Niceness says comfort is more important than doing what's right. Now, before I go any further, I need to acknowledge that we use these words, nice, right, and good, in many different and sometimes overlapping ways. Dictionary.com, for example, lists 15 different definitions for nice, 48 definitions for right, and around 50 for good. Take the shortest list of definitions for the word nice and select those that at least have something to do with morality or ethical behavior, and we still have meanings that include agreeable, tactful, perceptive, polite, virtuous, proper, fastidious, and, believe it or not, wanton. So fair warning, I'm going to use these words in ways that first make sense to me, and second are consistent with how they're used in Into the Woods. As always, your mileage may vary. First, being nice. Clearly, the witch sees being nice as a bad thing when the other characters can't decide what to do about the giant. And in her UU World article, Kimberly Debus rejects niceness when it's about wanting to be liked, not offending anyone, letting bad behavior go unchallenged, and in the end, failing to prevent injustice. I would call that terminal niceness, but of course it's not the only option. In recent years, we've seen politics give up all pretense of being, well, polite, thanks to the former president taking mainstream what has been called the politics of insult. Don't like somebody else's opinion? Good news, you don't need to limit yourself to merely saying you disagree with them anymore. Instead, you can call them names and question their parentage. And if openly doubting their patriotism isn't enough, you can go ahead and name them an enemy of the people. Obviously, that should be unacceptable. And it would have been shut down as such long before now if only one of our two political parties hadn't sold its collective soul in their naked pursuit of power. There is something to be said for civility, and I applaud the civic organizations that are working to bring people together around common issues so that we can remember that all people have inherent worth and dignity. Sometimes, to get something done, we do need to build on what agreements we already have and find some way to meet in the middle. But at other times, no, we should not compromise. If someone wants to burn down your house, you don't compromise with them by letting them only set fire to your garden shed. We are also aware that being nice can be a mask. If you're from the South or have lived here long enough, you know that sometimes saying bless your heart isn't meant in kindness, but actually means something like, I don't understand how you haven't yet died from your own stupidity. And we've all been taught by society that when it comes to many uncomfortable situations, the nice thing to do is avoid conflict and vote with our feet by leaving. The irony is that for all the witch wanted to do what she thought was right, in the end, she could only do what was nice. In short, while being intentionally rude and insulting people rather than engaging them in honest dialogue, while in other words being the opposite of nice, is generally not socially acceptable, sometimes civility alone is not enough to stop incivility. More pointedly, being nice is not an adequate response to bigotry, threats, dehumanization, and violence. So let's turn to being right. The witch thought it was right to hand Jack over to the giant in order to save everyone else. In a good example of the ethical theory of utilitarianism, namely doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In this case, the giant would continue destroying homes, trampling the woods, and randomly killing people until Jack was sacrificed to her, at which point everyone else would be safe again. So the witch reasoned, giving Jack to the giant sooner rather than later would save more people than keeping him hidden, and thus it was the right thing to do. Jack's life would be the smaller price to pay to save everyone else versus everyone ending up dead anyway. There are endless discussions about applying such ethical theories to moral dilemmas. And in fact, this situation in Into the Woods is a version of the famous trolley problem, which has been the subject of a Sunday morning forum as well as an episode of The Good Place. What I take away from those discussions is that no matter how we try to apply abstract ethical theories in our search for the singularly right thing to do, we might still end up with a choice between various unpleasant, even wrong-feeling options instead. Certainly the pandemic has been an exercise in that. Or you could try to make life easier by coming up with some simple set of rules to follow. Rather than judging a decision right or wrong by its consequences, as in the case of utilitarianism, you judge it right or wrong based on whether it follows the rules or not. That sounds a lot simpler, but sooner or later you're going to come across a situation where the rules don't work. And then you have to make a new rule. Inevitably, you have to keep adding rules and make sure that all of the rules are consistent with one another. And sooner or later, the whole structure collapses under its own weight. Or maybe instead of ethical theories or rules, we follow the truth. I will admit that I love to be right in that sense, and I know I'm not the only one. Some of that comes from my academic career, where it's the pursuit of truth that matters most. Unfortunately, that often spills over into arrogance and arguably cruelty when it comes to showing that a fellow academic made a mistake. I remember one of the weekly seminars in the research group where I worked in Connecticut, when a guest presenter had only just arrived on a long international flight. He was clearly exhausted, but that didn't stop some others at the seminar from grilling him on everything he said and picking apart everything questionable. I felt really bad for him. Wanting to be right also comes from our culture. As it says in the guidelines we adopt as a covenant for many of our online workshops, most of us have learned well how to show our disagreement by making the other person wrong. This happens in direct, indirect, verbal, and non-verbal ways. The guidelines go on to note that when we attack, shame, or blame others, we are less likely to take in what they are sharing and less likely to problem solve across our differences. Or, as one wise UUFP member said to me a few years ago, what's more important, being right or being in relationship? And that brings us to being good. If being right is about following some external ideal, whether it's an ethical theory or a set of rules or the truth, and if being nice is about maintaining calm and avoiding conflict, at least for oneself, then being good is about prioritizing our relationships. Into the Woods, this doesn't happen until the very end, when the surviving characters realize how much they need one another, acknowledging that even though everybody makes mistakes, no one is alone. When Kimberly Debus talked about kindness in her UU World article, she's essentially describing being good in terms of being kind. What matters is the relationship, not only with family and loved ones, but with the wider human family, indeed the interdependent web of all existence itself. Here's some more of what Debus says about kindness, but I'm putting in the word goodness instead. Goodness doesn't sit still, and goodness acts in big and small ways. Goodness calls elected representatives and writes letters and goes to protest marches and makes sure everyone who wants to have a voice has one. Goodness donates to groups in need and stands outside of Planned Parenthood and escorts women seeking medical treatment. Goodness puts on angel wings and shields a grieving family from a Westboro Baptist Church protest. Goodness prays for the protection of sacred land and water and asks forgiveness. Goodness mourns hate-motivated deaths, and goodness works for racial justice because it knows that Black lives matter. I agree with Debus that Unitarian Universalism doesn't call us to be nice, though I will add that this doesn't mean we can forego civility and respect. And being right has its place when it comes to fixing a toilet or paying a bill or serving food at a potluck that won't poison everyone. But at the end of the day, I believe, Unitarian Universalism calls us to be good because being good is about bringing our best selves to our relationships. Now, if you were here with me in the sanctuary, I'd ask you to take a look at the name of the tune of our opening hymn, When I Am Frightened. And you'd all flip through singing the journey to find it, and someone would call out that the tune is called Ethical Relations. And I'd say, yes, isn't that appropriate? That for a hymn about compassion, acceptance, and commitment, the name of the tune is Ethical Relations. And then I'd point out that because the hymn doesn't have a regular rhythm to the words, the tune has an irregular meter. So at the bottom of the page, it actually says Ethical Relations Irregular. And we'd all have a laugh about it. Oh well, maybe another time. So how does covenant fit into this ethical framework of nice, right, and good? If Unitarian Universalism calls us to be good, does that mean covenant is not about being nice or right? To keep this simple and concrete, let's think about covenant in the most basic terms as a set of promises that all of the people in a group agree to make to one another about how they're going to behave when they're together in that group. Such a covenant might begin with something like, we promise to prioritize our time with one another, letting the others in the group know when we can't come, and being fully present when we do come. Well, that's already about being in relationship with one another, and it's about more than being nice. I mean, if it weren't for this promise, you could come to a group meeting, you could be polite to everyone else, you could sit there quietly without distracting anyone else, and you could still pay absolutely no attention to what anyone else is saying. That's being nice, but this promise asks you for more than that. What about being right? If you do prioritize your time together, and you let others know when you can't come, and you're fully present when you do, does that mean you're right? Does it mean that anybody who doesn't keep that promise is wrong? No, I don't think it does. I mean, if this is a promise you've made, and you don't keep it, whether intentionally because you were in a mood or accidentally because you fell asleep, well, you need to own that. And that's called accountability, and it's part of being a normal adult. But it doesn't mean you're wrong. I've heard stories, by the way, of some UUs who've treated the UUA's principles as if they were rules. So you're right if you obey them, whatever obey means in this case, and you're wrong if you don't. I'm sure it doesn't surprise you to hear that treating the principles as rules results in disaster. The promises we make to one another in our covenants are not rules to obey, and we keep our promises for the sake of our relationships, not because we'll be punished if we don't. Covenants, in other words, are about being good, because the promises that we agree to make to one another spell out how we intend to be good. A covenant that simply says we promise to be good obviously needs more specifics. We promise to be kind is better. We promise to share our time together by making sure everyone has time to speak is even better, by specifying one way that we can treat one another with kindness. Covenants are not about being comfortable or preventing conflict. Covenants are not about dictating behavior. Covenants are about how we can be good because our relationships matter. I don't know how common it is that musical theatre teaches us something about morality or ethical philosophies. I mean, enjoying a story and leaving with a tune you can hum are usually the main attractions. But so far as I know, Into the Woods is unique in making a version of the trolley problem a major part of the plot. So I encourage you to find a recording, whether the Disney movie or the stage musical that is aired on PBS or the soundtrack, and spend some time thinking about what it means to be nice, right, and good. You might just learn something about yourself on that journey too. May it be so.